Good day, everyone. This is another lesson discussion in Linguistic and Literary Stylistics, which is entitled Stylistics and Ideological Perspectives. So, for the intended learning outcomes for this lesson, first, demonstrate a deep knowledge of social reading and ideological position of a literary text. Next, utilize critical discourse analysis to examine a literary text. Stylistics and Ideological Perspectives. In the previous lessons, we usually focus on the individual interpretation of literary texts. We discuss how stylistics analysis can focus on particular linguistic features in the text and the literary effects they have on the readers. We also discuss how texts create new contexts and the alternative realities they represent. Hence, this results in a range of cognitive and affective experiences that eventually create divergent reading. However, individuality is also a social construct. This means that it can evoke responses or reactions to various socio-cultural influences. The response to literary text is necessarily influenced by the socio-cultural values and beliefs that define these groups. This means that there are ideologies embedded in the text because of the socio-cultural elements attached to them. Hence, the interpretations of literary texts can also be done through such ideologies. For example, the use of ideological perspectives such as Marxism, feminism, and post-colonial perspectives. These ideological perspectives are used to understand particular sociocultural, economic, and political contexts that are evident in the literary text. These theories have produced revisions of traditional critical readings of canonical texts, arguing that these traditional readings are not neutral but are implicitly ideological. Hence, others argue that there are literary texts intended to convey ideologies, especially the works of authors that are suppressed or neglected, such as the working class and writers, women writers, African American writers, and those representative of other minorities. So this affects the transition in how we interpret literary texts from an individual perspective to a social reading that reveals possible significance that could be unnoticed. So here we are concerned with it as an ideological positioning of the reader and its effect on interpretation. For example, the novels of Charles Dickens, they contain dramatic descriptions, intricate plots, and colorful characterization. But if we're going to be critical of the underlying ideological significance, you'll notice that what is represented as the desirable norm of goodness and virtue is connected to the values of the middle class. The main figures in a story are heroes and not heroines. There are women characters that they are always supporting and subordinate characters and never the main protagonist. Once our attention is drawn to the potential ideological significance of literary texts, we become sensitized to the possibility of alternative readings linked to sociopolitical values. So once we notice the features and elements in the text that can be associated with ideological perspectives, we'll become drawn to reading materials related to sociopolitical values, such as the works of Marxist and feminist critics. This indicates the disconnectedness of literary texts naturally evokes various discourses. Hence, analyzing the alternative realities that ideological criticism provides is a social reading rather than being individual. However, this does not make the criticism more definite or authoritative, but are partial interpretation. Okay, the example of Charles Dickens' novels demonstrates how ideological interpretation can be injected into elements of the story, such as character and plot. Here are some lines from Alexander Pope's poem, Epistle to a Lady, of the characters of women. See how the world its veterans rewards, a youth of frolics, an old age of cards. Fair to no purpose, artful to no end, young without lovers, old without a friend, fought their passion, but their prize a sought. alive, ridiculous, and dead for God. So in this poem, we would notice the stylistics in the lines. The textual patterns develop in lines 244 to 6. How the line 247 disrupts the pattern by subtly reversing the structure. How the pattern is then reasserted in the following line, and ending the passage with a kind of empathic finality. So, by being critical of these lines, we will understand that this verbal craft is redirected at the denigration of women. The poem contains a dismissively negative stereotype of the female character, a representation of male prejudice, and the artistry crafted in the lines makes this negative representation more effective. Hence, the verbal art can be admirable, but the representations are deplorable. And there are literary texts that are direct and more blatant, just like the poem. And there are other texts that are less obvious, just like Devonshire Street, where the situation of the wife is deeply moving because of the dreadful and hopeless situation that the poem implies. Her bitter realizations, desperation, and pain are evident in the poem. And these emotions can be felt by anybody regardless of sex. But the feminist stylistics could have different perspectives of the situation. For them, this is the dominant reading. Though this is not the intention of the author, since we won't know anyway, however, it appears to be the obvious one because of the dominant ideologies about the role of women in society at the time when the poem was published. Though we can be drawn by these ideologies, the meaning of the text is not intrinsic to it, but always negotiable. Hence, feminists can only criticize what is dominant in the text and construct an alternative reading on which they base their assumptions. Feminist stylistics is considered as persistent reading, which is seen as a suitable starting point for any discussion for other elements that might produce an analysis and interpretations. It is the reality of his experience that we are drawn into. His wife stands timidly by, she is set aside, inanimate features of the scene are described but she is not. So in the Devonshire Street poem, inanimate features of the scene are described but the wife is not, even though the wife did the actual action, while the man was just stating his state of mind. In the poem, there are two examples of speech and thought representation. O merciless hurrying Londoners, why was I made for the long and painful deathbed coming to me? It's cheaper to take the tube to Piccadilly, and then we can catch a 19 or 22. So in the first line, it conveys not what the man actually says, but the kind of thoughts that are running through his mind. In the second line, it is a direct speech and provides us the wife's actual words. So we can see the sexist gloss here by concluding the marginalized position of the wife. The poem demonstrated more of the man's sensations and emotions, while the woman is shown to be capable only of a superficial response. So another example. Having looked at poetry as a site of questionable theology, we shall now turn to a piece of prose fiction, which is The Million, The Flaws by George Eliot. In the book of George Eliot, The Mill on the Floss, one could also take an ideological perspective and read into a prefiguration of the typical male-female differences in ways of behaving and speaking in adult relationships, because the differences feminist linguists claim have already begun in early childhood. Observational studies have shown that in their play world, boys give orders, are overbearing, and are prepared to use physical force to get what they want. In the world Girls also want to get their way but go about it differently. The way Tom and Maggie go about sharing the jump path is a perfect illustration of the socially determined clash between the behaviors and conversational styles of boys and girls set out above. As was pointed out earlier, it is of the very nature of literature that it gives rise to diverse interpretations, and once alerted to the possibility of reading ideological significance into a text, we can, of course, interrogate any work of literature along this line. So, as previously mentioned, literature, by its very nature, lends itself to several readings. Once we are aware that ideological significance may be inserted into any text, we can naturally analyze any literary work in this way. So this kind of analysis is beneficial since it challenges conventional certainties, but it raises complex issue of the relationship between aesthetic and moral judgments. So to what extent may one accept or reject a literary work based on the type of reality it portrays? So how much should stylistic analysis and critical appraisal of literary works be guided by any expressed commitment to a specific geopolitical position? So these are just some of the questions that can be raised in understanding the ideological perspectives embedded in literary texts. Incorporation of literary criticism into linguistic criticism. The adoption of social perspective is based on the belief that literary texts can be construed as verbalizations of sociocultural and political values. So this means that literary texts reflect the sociocultural and political values that are formed and subscribed to by the members of one society. These literary texts can be in many forms, such as advertisements, newspaper reports, guidebooks, promotional pamphlets, and among others. All of these can be perceived as social documents which contain ideological positions that are conveyed explicitly or implicitly. Two consequences would seem to follow from this social perspective on literature. The first is that there is no essential difference between literary and non-literary texts in that both are expressions of social reality, the distinction between representation and reference. So this means that both non-literary and literary texts contain representations of social realities. Hence, understanding the sociological perspectives conveyed in both types of texts can be deciphered in the representation and reference. The second consequence is that the stylistic procedures of close analysis will be indistinguishable, no matter whether they are applied to literary and non-literary texts. So this means that the process of evaluating sociological perspectives using the stylistics analysis is the same. So both can be analyzed using the same lenses. Critical discourse analysis. In the previous discussions, we focused on the headlines by relating their linguistic forms to a relevant social practice. Hence, the headlines are treated as a form of discourse. What we did not do, however, was to politicize this discourse by assuming that linguistic choices in all texts are consciously or unconsciously motivated by particular value systems and beliefs, and that the resulting discourses are therefore always presented from some ideological perspective. So this means that any forms of text are treated as discourse, and whether it's the intention of the writer or not, these texts are inspired by particular social practices, such as value systems and beliefs, and they represent some ideological perspectives. So the politicization of this business is called critical discourse analysis, or CDA. The epithet critical implies revealing how conventional cues of language are imbued with ideological positions of which, more often than not, many people are not aware. Their continual exposure to dominant norms, value systems, and beliefs, which are linguistically mediated in the discourses of influential political, social, and cultural institutions like the press, government, the legal system, and the educational system, has caused them to lose this awareness. So because of conveying such themes that contain ideological perspectives and people are constantly exposed to these perspectives, many people believe that this is the normal ideological position and perceive it as common sense. Consider the headlines produced by the British tabloid The Sun, which contain discourses that convey representations about women that are discriminatory stereotypes. For example, the remarks, this excited Welsh blonde, Crimper Helen, the bubbly blonde, bitchy Narinder, and among others. This discriminatory naming is not a property of the language as text, but as a discourse. And this is how the language is used in the broad context of British society. Regardless that these remarks are not discriminatory, the daily bombardment of these stereotypes can reinforce a dominant ideology that can form a common idea that women belong to a distinct gender category. As a result of these linguistic devices, common in tabloids and used to relate to the reader, both headlines represent a speaking voice. This raises the question of whose voice we are hearing and therewith whose perspective is adopted. Also, who is being addressed. So this means that there's a danger of politicizing discourses by inducing ideological perspectives in people that instead the voice of the headlines are owned by the writers of these texts. People may be influenced by these perspectives and make it as their own. It seems that CDA's commitment to expose the way in which language in use mediates a usually hidden ideological representation of the world is salutary. This means that CDA is beneficial in bringing out hidden ideological perspectives that are perpetuated by the use of language. However, doing CDA can also be influenced by our own biases and political perspectives. Hence, if not addressed, there will be an imbalance in the analysis and interpretation. This problem also brings to the position of readers in CDA. If the analyst is not equipped with the knowledge and ideological discourses, so how are they going to deal with critical discourse analysis? Perhaps the most important claim that can be made for stylistics is that its very precision of analysis reveals how divergent and various the effects of different features of style can be. So this only shows how rich the language is as a source for making meanings, regardless of how meaningful the discourse is, uncertain and elusive. So here are the references of my discussion. And that's the end of this lesson discussion. Thank you for watching the video.